Imagine walking a forest road you have traveled many times before in medieval Europe. The trees have not changed, yet the feeling of the road begins to shift inside the mind. Nothing has moved, yet everything begins to feel unfamiliar as daylight slowly disappears. For medieval travelers, safety was never a place. It was something they slowly left behind. Safety in medieval Europe was not defined by distance, but by how much light remained around you. The moment the last clear light breaks through the trees, the forest begins to feel like a different place. We have followed these roads for generations, believing they remain the same, but perception begins to fail first. The road does not change, but the human mind starts to lose its certainty inside the growing shadows. What once felt like a familiar path now begins to feel like a space the forest slowly reclaims.
Safety begins to fade, not when danger appears, but when clarity slowly disappears.
The forest does not become more dangerous first, it simply becomes less readable. In medieval Europe, safety was not a destination. It was a condition that could vanish within minutes. The last traces of daylight begin to break apart, not suddenly, but slowly, as if the forest is absorbing them. What feels like darkness is not sudden. It is the slow loss of certainty about what remains visible. The forest remains unchanged, yet human perception begins to reconstruct it into something unfamiliar. In medieval travel, safety was never a fixed place. It moved with the light itself. Every step forward carries a traveler farther from certainty and deeper into unreadable space. What travelers called danger was often just the moment their senses stopped agreeing with the world around them. A road does not need to change for fear to appear. It only needs to become harder to read. In the forest, certainty fades long before danger arrives, quietly and without warning. The forest does not grow darker all at once. It teaches the eye to doubt what it once trusted. What once felt like distance in the forest slowly becomes uncertainty in perception. The road remains the same, yet the mind begins to fill what the eyes can no longer clearly confirm.
When light breaks apart, even familiar ground begins to feel like it is changing its shape.
In the forest, nothing needs to move for uncertainty to appear. Only visibility has to weaken. The deeper the traveler goes, the more the forest begins to define what can and cannot be clearly seen. What feels like the forest changing is often the traveler losing certainty in what remains in front of them. In medieval travel, danger was rarely sudden. It was the slow loss of reliable perception. The forest does not move closer. The mind simply loses the ability to separate distance from shadow. Every step deeper into the forest is also a step away from the certainty of what the eyes once clearly understood. When daylight weakens enough, even familiar paths begin to lose their certainty inside the mind. The forest remains unchanged, yet the human sense of direction begins to weaken as light disappears. What the traveler calls darkness is often the point where the mind begins to complete what the eyes can no longer fully see. When the eye loses detail, the mind begins to substitute certainty with assumption. In the forest, nothing needs to change for fear to grow. Only clarity needs to fade. The forest does not become unfamiliar first. The human ability to read it begins to fail first. A forest remains the same, but once light is reduced, even familiar distance becomes uncertain. What once felt like distance is now reduced to a fragile interpretation of shapes and shadows. The forest does not move closer. The mind simply loses the ability to separate what is near from what is far. At this stage of travel, the road is no longer something you see clearly. It is something you trust. In the forest, uncertainty begins the moment the eyes can no longer fully confirm what the mind expects to see. What travelers once called distance slowly becomes a question the eyes can no longer answer with certainty. When visibility weakens, the mind begins to replace certainty with interpretation. In medieval travel, the greatest risk was not what appeared in the forest, but what could no longer be clearly distinguished. The forest remains unchanged, yet human judgment begins to carry more weight than the eyes themselves. At this point, the traveler no longer trusts what is seen first, but what is remembered about the road. In the forest, survival is often less about seeing the path clearly and more about remembering where it should be. When light becomes unreliable, the traveler begins to measure reality through uncertainty rather than sight. The forest does not alter its structure for the traveler. The traveler simply loses the ability to confirm it clearly. At the edge of dusk, the forest does not become darker first. The mind simply stops receiving enough detail to remain certain. When visibility weakens enough, the traveler begins to rely less on what is seen and more on what is assumed. The forest does not change its path, yet the human mind begins to question whether the path is still clearly visible. What was once distance becomes uncertainty, and what was certainty becomes interpretation. At this stage, the forest does not need to hide anything. The loss of clarity does it for it. When vision weakens, the traveler begins to rely on memory rather than sight to define the road ahead. In the forest, certainty is never taken away all at once. It dissolves slowly until it can no longer be trusted. The deeper the traveler goes, the more the forest becomes a question rather than a landscape. At this point, the forest no longer hides anything. The human eye simply cannot confirm what it once understood. The forest does not need to become darker for fear to grow. It only needs to become less readable. At the boundary of dusk, the traveler no longer sees the road as clearly as before, only trusts that it continues. What remains of the road is no longer a clear visual object, but a fragile line held together by memory and habit. At this stage, the forest does not feel closer. It only feels less clearly separated from the traveler. The forest does not need to change its form. The loss of light is enough to transform everything within it. At this point, the traveler no longer sees the road as a continuous object, but as a sequence of partial confirmations. When certainty fades, the traveler begins to depend less on sight and more on the fragile assumption that the path still exists. At the edge of dusk, the forest no longer feels like it is changing. The traveler simply loses the ability to confirm its stability. At this stage, the forest does not need to conceal anything. The human eye simply cannot maintain certainty anymore. When light falls below a certain point, even familiar space begins to feel like it is being reconstructed by memory alone. At the edge of full dusk, the traveler no longer sees the road clearly, and they recognize it only through what they expect it to be. When clarity disappears completely, even the most familiar path becomes something the mind must reconstruct rather than observe. At the threshold of complete darkness, the road is no longer seen. It is only remembered as something that must continue forward. When sight can no longer confirm direction, movement itself becomes the only remaining proof of the path. At this point, the forest is no longer something the eye can describe. It is only something the body moves through. When the forest becomes fully unreadable, the traveler no longer follows the road. They follow continuity. The border between safety and fear is never crossed. It is slowly forgotten as light disappears.